Hello, everyone. This is Grace Kraaijvanger, your host of The Art of What's Next. And today's episode is super special to me as I'm sharing a conversation with my dear friend, Tara Mohr. Tara is an expert on women's leadership and well being, and she wrote one of my favorite books called Playing Big. It was actually named a Best Book of the Year by Apple iBooks. And she's created an incredible global Playing Big leadership program for women and a Playing Big facilitators training for coaches, therapists, and mentors. She is a mother of three, and I'm so lucky that she's my dear friend. Without further ado, let's dive into the conversation that Tara and I share in the same style as our friendship: honest, vulnerable, and curious. I'm so honored to have my dear friend Tara Mohr on the show. Tara, I'm so glad you're with us today. You're one of my favorite people. You're a dear friend. You wrote a gorgeous book called Playing Big that I know has been so impactful for so many people in my life and way beyond. And I just really appreciate us getting this chance to sit down and have a conversation together.
Me too. Thank you for having me. And you're one of my favorite people too, and an artist and entrepreneur and leader and human that I just admire so much.
Mm,
So I'm glad we
likewise.
get to do this.
Tara and I, every once in a while, we do these co-working days together, and I think that we have that. We get a lot of creative energy from each other, and I would encourage our listeners out there to find people that you can sit next to and give that reciprocity of creative energy because it's just been so much fun for us. I love that we get to do that.
Absolutely. And go to a fun place to do it as we try to do. Yeah.
Exactly. Actually, I'll actually tell a story about Tara that's one of my favorites. One of our very first, well, I don't know if it was our first, but one of our meetings together when we had just met almost 10 years ago now. You had suggested that we go to the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. And it really taught me a great lesson of how much it matters to put yourself in beautiful environments, and that you can do that for meetings, you can do that for solo work, you can do that for brainstorming. So I just wanted to share that story because it was so special to me and it really made a big difference for me. It sat with me.
Yeah. I feel like if you have time to have a meeting, like try and have time to have it somewhere beautiful. And also, I wouldn't have asked anyone to do that either. So it's like the power of like feeling like you have a fellow creative friend in your life who's going to get why you'd want to go have a conversation at the art museum is a special thing.
That's true. That's true. I love it. So let's for those of you that may not be familiar with Tara's work, again, I mentioned her book Playing Big, which has just been very instrumental for me and many people in the hybrid community far beyond. I meet people all the time that tell me that their life was changed by your book. Tell us a bit about Playing Big, about the concept of Playing Big, and what prompted you initially to write that book, I think almost a decade ago.
Yeah, yeah. And like anything with our life story, it's like the initial can begin at the literal point of when did I start thinking about the book, or in my childhood of what gave rise to my interest in my mother's
Yes.
childhood. So it's like, where do we begin the story? But I think a decent place to begin is that I grew up very aware of all the places that I felt like women's voices were missing. And I would just notice that from a very young age. And it really pained me. And some of that pain was personal, like, well, I'm a girl, I'm a woman, I feel left out. Like, why aren't we reading any books by women in English class? And why aren't we talking about women in history class? And um, all of that. I sometimes joke, like, I think I read more books growing up where animals talked than where women talked.
Yes, I remember that feeling so clearly too. And it was a notable gap.
For sure, for sure. And so I always felt called to do something around that and inspired to do something around that. And even as a kid, I would be the one like organizing the Women's Issues Club or lobbying for different books to be in the curriculum. And I didn't really know what form that interest might take in my adult life.
Right.
I also grew up super interested in psychology and spirituality, and I had a pretty unique home where my mom was teaching me about the unconscious and the subconscious and Freud and Jung and uh, looking at things like through a really psychological lens from the time I was really young. So there was another track in my life that was all about like how our inner lives shape our outer lives. They aren't the only things that shape our outer lives, but how they do, and sort of that whole sphere of personal growth and inner work I always loved. Um, and also thank you to Oprah and thank you to the new age bookstores in my town that I could go to
Yes.
after school. I was that kid who, got my driver's license and asked my parents, could I take the car and go to a Zen retreat center? It was the first thing I wanted to do.
I wish I had known you then because I was the kid who, first of all, like so many of us, watched Oprah every day after school. And I will never forget going to a new age bookstore with crystals in the window. And for me, it was the first time of seeing anything like that kind of content
Mm,
of like inner work and really more philosophical inspection of who we are and who we want to be. And I remember being like, these are my people. I wish I had known you then.
I know. I didn't know any really fellow teens that I could do that with. Yeah. So all of that. And then I went into the working world and really started to see this other aspect of how women's voices were missing. That like the crash between these ideals I had been raised with, like you can do anything and women have, American women have all these rights and access now, and you just put your mind to it. And then I went to work in a large philanthropic foundation that had $2 billion under management, was giving away a lot of money. And it was the kind of organization where there were a ton of really bright, well-qualified, hardworking women sort of through the ranks. And
Yeah.
then around the table, the decision-making table was almost exclusively men who were also less diligent and hardworking and thoughtful about the decisions being made than these women whose voices weren't really getting adequate power. So that was very sobering. And then concurrently to working there, I got trained as a coach and started a coaching practice. And that's where I started to feel like all my clients were these brilliant, inspiring women who could not see their own brilliance and did not feel ready yet to go for their dreams, and were really riddled with self-doubt. That really, we could talk about it as self-doubt, but it's just like a very inaccurate self-perception and self-assessment.
Right. Right.
Um, and as a coach, you kind of fall in love with each client and see their power and potential. And so that gap was just so painful. And it also felt like that gap was really creating this world where the best ideas and the most conscientious leaders and all of that were not in charge. So all of that was the beginning of the genesis of playing big. And then specifically working with those coaching clients and having to figure out why. I mean, eventually I became less interested in why we feel all that self-doubt, but more just what do we do about it? And really, what are the thresholds that women in our time need to cross through to kind of unlearn millennia of silencing and marginalization and step into our potential.
Right. Right. And I mean, how did it begin for you? Did you, you certainly experienced the pain and then do you sit down and say like, I'm going to write this book and I'm going to take everything I've learned and like, how was that process for you?
First, it was the process was began with just like, uh-oh, I have these amazing clients. They're paying me money for coaching sessions. I'm supposed to help them produce these changes in their lives. But my generic coaching training, which was wonderful, but was very generalized, like didn't really tell me how to work with the kind of issues that were coming up for them.
Right.
So
Right.
the first part was like, what even is going to be helpful, and just experimenting in my coaching practice and reflecting on in my own life, because I was not beyond by any means the issues they were talking about. I had all those
Of,
issues. That's why
of
I was
course.
interested in them.
Me too. Me too.
It's like, I see this, I recognize this. So kind of experimenting in my own life, experimenting in my coaching practice for a couple years to really see what were the patterns of what was most helpful and most transformative for people
Yeah. Yeah.
and for a diversity of women. And then once I felt like, okay, I see the arc of what is really helping people and what needs to happen within that arc. Then I started teaching a course about that. At the time, it was literally people dialed in on the phone. Like there was no Zoom. Everyone was calling in on their telephones.
I love that. I love that.
And so I started a Playing Big course, I think in about 2010. And started teaching those same coaching concepts, but in like a group workshop format. And then I did that for a few years. And then when it felt like, okay, we have hundreds of alum with really great feedback and track record of impact. I know this model is helping people, and how can I help it reach more people? Then I embarked on the process of the book. And the book has really, been wonderful in allowing the model to reach many more people.
I mean, I think it's extraordinary because I think it's somewhat rare that, especially when you look at the past decade that we have experienced as a society, and how much has happened in the space of women's issues, from women's empowerment to women's health issues. But there's just the gamut of things that we have experienced in the last decade. And your book, and for those of you that haven't read it yet, like, just drop what you're doing and pick it up immediately, because your book it feels, and I picked it up right before this interview again, and it feels like it's speaking to, for me, it always feels like it's speaking to what I need right now.
Mm,
And I'm curious how it's been for you in the journey of 10 years of the book and teaching women how to play big. I'm sure that even the definition of what it means to play big has evolved for you in 10 years. So, how has that been for you, of this journey of guiding women using these principles that I find to be very evergreen, very like very timely, as timely now as they were then, and as timely, in 20 years. But talk to us about what that's like to be in that process of guiding women through a time that has also, we've experienced a lot.
yeah, we have. Yeah, we have experienced a lot. You know, I think, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, and I'd be curious too for how you feel like this has played out in your work supporting women. But I think the time that I started doing this work was a very heady time. Like there was this explosion of like new technology that's allowing people to start their own businesses online, and new fields that people are really like, the idea that you could have a passion driven career and be self-employed. Like this was all so exciting. And that was a channel through which a lot of women wanted to step into that playing bigger. Like, I
Mhm.
want to share my own voice as an individual. I want more autonomy and meaning in my work. Um, and I feel almost like collectively we've been through this like big cycle around that now, where it's like a lot of us have tried that. It's turned out to be harder than we thought. It's not 100% pitnik, though there's many things that are wonderful about it. There's economic realities,
Mhm.
just collectively, that are affecting us. So there's kind of a sobering around that. And what I hope happens around that is, and what I feel happening is like, it's less of a heady, optimistic, buzzy time around all that, but that could be an opportunity that allows us to more get to the kernel of what we wanted anyway,
Yes.
right? Which
Yes.
is like integrity with ourselves and days.
Meaning, yes, meaningful work, and yes,
Yes. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good thing if we're just like coming back to those kernels. So that's one big evolution that I see. I think some of us, myself included, were a little bit in that idea that we were making linear progress forward around women's rights. And now that narrative, if that is true, it's certainly a looping, zigzaggy forward movement. So there's a lot of grief, I think, and sobering around that. But again, I feel like the opportunity there is it is so much more crystal clear that the status quo is not working.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that can be empowering, I think, right?
I think so too. And what I think is interesting about the work that you do and the work that I do is that, and it's funny because I met you right around the same time that I had just started the Hivery and the book had just come out. So that was 10 years ago. So we've been on this journey together. And one thing that I've certainly experienced as an individual, and I know that so many women that you and I both work with have experienced, is that during these times that felt and continue to feel urgent and unknown and uncertain, of course, that impacts our confidence as individual human beings,
Mm,
like, and so I feel like as these things are happening around us, in externally in the world, um, I think sometimes we maybe forget what that is doing to us as individuals
mm,
in terms of our when things feel uncertain, how could we feel sure? How could we feel um the confidence that our whatever that meaning that we are trying to create, that will be received, or that there's a place for that, or that it's good enough, or all of the things that happen for us when it comes to confidence. So what I've seen is just that the work of reminding and empowering women that they have all of that brilliance inside them that we see from the outside, but they don't always see. And I say we don't always see. I have struggled with my confidence so much in the past few years with, with the things that have happened in my business and the world. Um, and so I think I just bring it back to this idea that the teachings and the lessons and the wisdom that you're offering are bringing individuals that are going through an enormous collective experience. You're putting like refilling the well of that confidence.
yeah. Yeah. And maybe one thing we can talk about is, I mean, the approach in playing big has always been, okay, you're going to have an inner critic. How do you not try and graduate from that, but really manage your relationship to self-doubt in
Right.
a wise way? And that just all the research suggests that we're going to grapple with self-doubt no matter how senior we are, no matter what we accomplish, es- especially if we're still trying to stretch out of our comfort zone and do
Yes.
things that feel uncertain. We're going to have that. So that's kind of always been a foundation, but especially more and more in recent years, I have started to just think of that as like, why do we even need self-assessment thoughts? Like any kind of thought
That's interesting.
that involves self-assessment, I am not sure that ever helps us, because we're not reliable assessors of ourselves at all. And it's also not the most relevant or interesting question. Like the question of, am I ready? Am I good enough for? We're not going to answer that accurately, but it's also not as useful a question as like, is it important to me to do this? Is
Right.
this calling me? What's my felt experience when I am doing it? Um, and
And
yeah,
I imagine too, just to add to that, and who can I help and how does it make me feel when I help
exactly.
those people?
Exactly.
Like that's i- for me when I get stuck in confidence stuff and I'm like in that loop. And like you said, it's a very unhelpful and inaccurate conversation that's happening in my head of like, what am I doing? And can I do this? Am I making a difference? But when we bring that back to the idea of being of service to others, it can shut that inner conversation down and say, well, I really want to help others. I can get out of my own way in order to help other people. Right.
100%, 100%. And that's, sometimes like my like slogan form of that I like to just, it's easy to remember is the goal is not to think better of yourself. The goal is to think bigger than yourself.
Mm.
And because confidence, even if you're feeling good about yourself for those 5 minutes or 2 days, you're still stuck in self. Like, who wants to be sitting there, like, kind of glancing at whether it's a literal mirror or metaphoric mirror, being like, I'm good, I'm so good. And when we do that, we have to pump ourselves up in this way that, like, your gut knows, like, you're pumping, like, this is a little artificial, and we don't actually know how this thing we're doing is going to go. So your super ego voice trying to convince me it's going to go great because you're great. Like, that just feels more unstable and scary because you're kind of lying to yourself. And so I would much rather have people settle into, of course, I don't know how it's going to go. I do know I can take care of myself and be there for myself, even if it doesn't go well. I do know it not going well is sometimes part of the process. And then this is the impact I want to have that's guiding me. These are the people I want to serve, or just even connecting with values. Like, these are the values of mine that I'm going to lean into to move into action. I'm not trying to find motivation out of confidence. I think that's a
Yes.
really dangerous road.
I think that's brilliant because the thing about confidence, and it's so elusive and we're all looking for it and we all lose it, but it's so fleeting. What I think is what I've
Yeah,
learned as, certainly as an entrepreneur, but just as a human, I can feel great 1 minute and then get an email that can send me, from like a 10 to a 2 in a second. And so we have to like, I think part of what you're saying is that we have to decide how much weight we give to that roller coaster of confidence that is also being pulled around by external things we can't control,
totally, totally.
right?
And our values, or the bigger purposes, callings we're connecting to, that's just a more stable energy source to tap into.
I think that's so beautiful. And it gives us a like a light on a light on the path too, because I think, one of our main themes of this podcast is, it's called the art of what's next because we're talking about next chapters. And what often comes up for people in thinking about their next chapter is that kind of constant loop of, I'm not sure, I don't know, what if I don't know what it is? What if I don't know what I'm doing? What if I don't know where to go? And what you're describing is there's clues that light the path. So there may be those of us that do know, like, I know what I'm here to do. I know what meaningful work I'm creating. And there's those of us that are saying, I'm not sure yet. But you're offering this, like, who you help is the illumination, right?
Absolutely. It can be who you help. It can be just what's the thing that pains you and that you feel some pull to address. It can be what values are your anchor. Like, sometimes, so I have a lot to say about this. I don't know thing. So
Please do, because
say, yeah,
please do, because I hear it time and time and time again.
yeah.
I'd love to talk about that with you.
I mean, a few things that just feel really true after talking to so many different women about this. One is, I always say it's a foggy path, and usually what you get is about one half cobblestone in front of you, and then there's mist. But you
Right.
get one half cobblestone, and when you move into that cobblestone, you get the next half. So there's that. I also love this quote, and I'm blanking on the name of the person who said it. I think it's a physicist, but the quote is, the future usually arrives first as a feeling.
Mm,
And I think that's really true. And I find also, when I can give permission in a coaching session or workshop, like, what do you want? Just let it come in fragments of images. Or, who are you growing into? Let it come in fragments of images. I think we really, really, really undervalue the importance of imagery in setting our direction and
yes.
in what we're creating. So you just might see, oh, I see that I'm drinking coffee out of this gorgeous earthen mug in the morning, and I see that I'm walking outside, or I see that I'm wearing really comfortable shoes. Like, all of these are, like, really vivid clues about what wants to be born, or you might just say, I see myself, when people are thinking about what's their career next chapter, I see myself working with my hands in a studio. I see myself teaching a group of people. And then people get so scared because they feel like the only legitimate way to work towards something is to be able to write what their LinkedIn page will eventually say they are doing.
Right.
I'm like, this is not about, like, stop, get the LinkedIn page out of your brain. You do not need to know that. You do not need to know what it is called. You do not need to know what the name of the role or the this is that's going to be. I think we have to sort of court those images with
Yes.
love and allow it to feel fragmented and live into the imagery and see what comes from there.
Oh, it's just that's it. It's stunning because it gives us some action we can take when things feel unknown, of just allowing those fragments of images without needing to know the solution and the hows and the whys and the LinkedIn profile and the copy and the skills and the da, da, da. But it allows us to lean into that feeling. It What I love about it too is even in the exercise of conjuring up these fragments of images, you're starting there's two things I love. You're starting to feel a sense of priority of, like, for example, in the one where if someone, their priority is to be comfortable, their
Right.
priority is to spend time in nature. Someone else might have a vision of them being on a stage in front of 10,000 people. So their value is to be seen and heard and putting themselves in these large environments. And there's a lot of clues there.
Yes,
There's a
absolutely. And what also can be interesting is you can have 10 women saying, I see myself on the beach. And if you probe a little further, that has 10 completely different meanings. Like for somebody,
Yes,
that one person, that's about becoming playful. And for someone else, that's connection with nature. And someone else, that's slowing down. So it's like probing your own associations with those images to see what qualities they're speaking to. But even then, I just saw a beautiful quote um, fly by. I took a screenshot so I could get the name. I'll put it in the show notes. But the quote was, the metaphor knows more than you do. So even if you can't even name the qualities, like, you can just live into it for a little bit and it will become clear. And that is hard. That is we're talking about the unknown of the creative process. And that's very counter to what we learn in school and what we think of in career planning. But that is, as we both know, like from our art life too, like that just is the nature of the creative process, is
yes,
that trust, that unknown. And what's really happening there, it's not that something incoherent is happening. It's just that what's happening is not immediately available to your conscious mind to make sense of. And that's fine. That's a sign that it's like something pretty sophisticated and
yeah.
wonderful.
And what I think is interesting about that idea in both, and you bring it into your book, and I've done a number of events with you where we've experienced this together, right? And it's similar where you're guiding people through an intentional imagery or a 5-year vision or a 3-year vision, or even just like the fragments of images. What I think you offer people that I love is the reminder that this kind of clarity and these aha moments and these connections to our subconscious self, if we only allow time for them, like when we're in the shower, for example, that's one of my favorite, is like, if we only give that time and space when we're in the shower, it doesn't give us the kind of the juice and the space to really play in it and experiment it like an artist. I think that's where you
Mhm.
and I get into the creative process, like where we are both super excited by that, because when you give something time and space, when you go into the metaphorical studio of,
Yeah.
like, I'm going to see what I'm creating in my next chapter and just go play around with what comes up. And I don't have to hold on to that painting. I don't have to publish that book. I don't have to sculpt that pot or whatever that is. I can just play in the studio for a minute and see what images come up and how they make me feel.
Yeah. And what does that look like for you? Like, how do you actually do that? Is that like drafting things on the page? I'm kind of thinking of you also like moving things around again and again in physical space, which you're so brilliant at. But like, what does that actually look like for you?
That's it. I mean, that's actually a great example right there. Sometimes, when I had the hybrid spaces, the members would joke that they'd come in on Monday morning and all the furniture was changed around.
Yeah,
And I
often.
did that often, often. I did it for two reasons. One is that when I was like, the space was my palette. So when I was moving things around, that was my art form. That was my creative
Yeah.
expression that I was sharing with audience, with a community, with
Mhm.
the viewer, if you will, if we're going to use like
Yeah.
the painting metaphor. So I think that what was happening is that in the act of moving the furniture around, that was my creative process. So that allowed me to kind of go into that flow state and zone out a bit. I'm not checking email. I'm not worrying about, the this and that. I'm in that flow state of making something. So that was one reason that I did it.
Mm.
And I loved it. And I do it in my own house and I do it for friends. And I've done it at your house.
Yes, you have.
But I love it. It really, like, there's something about it that just makes me feel like I'm in creative flow. But the second reason I would do it at the hybrid is because it gives us a change of scenery, which gives us a change of perspective. So if we always sit in the same chair, facing the
Mhm.
same window, holding the same pen, open the same computer, I always drink my coffee with oat milk, I always do this, I always do that. It can There's a part of it, it's a line, right? Because I love ritual, but I also love shaking things up for people.
Mhm.
And I found that when we changed the environment a little bit, people saw things differently. They thought of things differently. They had a different kind of conversation. There was a different quality happening that might give them a new perspective on that feeling of uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad you brought that up because I mean, for me, that's a huge way I get in flow is just to like play in my environment. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we just can also really think about for women, I'm thinking about like how for women it's so important in particular because we get this good girl, good student thing that is all about over preparing and getting it right, which is our way of coping with being in a patriarchal world where we're getting so many things. It's like, well, we're not, you're not seeing a bunch of comfortable, laughing, full-bellied women up there, in front of the Fortune 500 company leading it. So we're just getting so many cues, like you don't actually belong, you're not actually the right type of human, you're not actually legitimate. And I think part of how we cope with that is we get more over preparing
Mhm.
and controlling, and it makes it really hard to be playful in the ways that you're talking about.
We talked about that. You and I've talked about that before, and like polishing the stone of like kind of hiding away this like secret talent and polishing it and polishing it and polishing it until it's so. I'm just thinking that we have to get it so perfect and so ready before we show it to the world, right?
100%.
And I think that's where you and I get so excited about all of the ways that we live through creativity because it strips all that away. Like the very essence of being creative is that you don't know the outcome. You don't know where it's going. You're just in the process and letting that guide you. And I mean, there are plenty of times I'm sure you feel this way in your writing. I know, like we both are dancers. I fell on stage. I fell so many times. Like there were so many of things just not going according to plan. And there's, as writers or painters, again, any kind of artist, how many times have people like done a sketch and thrown it away? There's so many ways that we create something without knowing exactly where it's going and allowing that to just inform us and guide us.
Yeah. And also yeah, inform and guide, I think is so important because when we get stuck I'm going to try and like make this concrete. I'm thinking about what would be an example I could give, but um, just even let's say teaching a class, I teach now a number of classes about coaching, about playing big, about this new work I'm doing around love. And sometimes things land with people the way I'm expecting they will, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes the things that I think will be most resonant are not. And something I say offhandedly is. And if I can always like just look at that as like, what is life telling me? how do I collaborate with life? That's all I really want to do in my creative process is collaborate with life. That's what feels good. So everything is just kind of an opportunity to listen and watch life revealing itself.
Mhm.
And I feel the same way if one of my kids is having a tantrum. I can have an idea that that's not supposed to happen, or I can be like, that's life revealing itself. And I really love and trust life. So what is that showing me? Oh, that's showing me, it's really hard for us human beings when our hearts get hurt, or it's showing me, wow, we really do need a whole lot of sleep to get through a challenging day. Like it's
Right.
always showing me, even hard things are always, I think, showing us something important about life,
Yes. And it
Yeah.
allows us to get more comfortable with the not knowing, with the, like, and I think that what you're describing is just is it's such a beautiful like antithesis of perfectionism, right? Because perfectionism is based on the idea that there is a known outcome, there is a prescribed way, and we won't reveal anything until we get to that prescribed way. But what you're describing is that the human experience is the unknowing, and then the reflection, and then like, oh, interesting, tantrum. What can I learn from that? What does that
Right.
experiment mean? Right?
Yeah. And I think we should also I also kind of want to ground in that it doesn't feel to me like it's all unknown or that it's fundamentally unknown. Like I think there's this tension and paradox because people, when we're talking about like when people are tuning into what's my next chapter or what do I want, there's very real, true, enduring things that come forward about like who's trying to emerge from them and the essential qualities that that being has. But I think a lot of times the particulars of how that manifests are not what we expect and are
Right.
unknown. Timelines are unknown. Lessons we need to learn along the way are unknown. Um, and yet we can also find a pretty steady like North Star within all of that. And that's important too. I think.
I agree. We've talked about that before, and I think we've even been on stage together talking about that before, of this idea of when you say, and I don't mean you, but when we say that we don't know what to do next, that we often do know, but we don't know how. We don't know the particulars, like you said. One place that I've really experienced the reveal in that, like that when I don't know what I want to do, I don't know what I want to do in my writing, I see the patterns where I'll find I'm like writing about the same things over and over again, the same topics, the same themes, the same heartbreak. And I'll
Yeah.
say, meanwhile, I'm saying, oh, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what to do next. And if I go back in the writing, it's all right there. The patterns are all right
Yes.
there.
Yes. Yeah. And usually when people say, I don't know, I mean, my go-to questions are often either what part do you know? And if a loving witness asks you, what part do you know? You will have a lot that comes out of your mouth about the parts that you know. Or sometimes it's just as simple as saying, what if you did know? Then what would the answer be? And then people will be like, oh, if I did know, it would be ba 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 ba. Um, and the third thing I find is that sometimes what's going on with I don't know is there's one calling or one idea for a next chapter, one inner pull that that person has written off, like deemed too ridiculous, too impractical, too scary. Then they have like the 30-second tier options. And so the 30-second tier options are equally compelling and not compelling to them. And so it feels like they're stuck in I don't know because they already eliminated the main thing or are pushing to aside the main thing. So
I
once we cover
definitely did this.
yeah, yeah,
I
with
definitely did this
creating the co-working space or
with
what?
creating the Hivery. I definitely did it. I remember, and um I think I shared this with you. I went out to lunch with someone who was a coach that I didn't know.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I went out to lunch, and it was before I started the Hivery. My mom had just passed away. I was in the space of, I don't know, so lost, so confused, so just like what. And I the other thing I'm just going to chime in on, sometimes when we feel um more urgency around wanting to know, around wanting to create a next chapter that feels like it aligns with our values, and we feel more, again, more urgency, is because something has happened. For me,
Yeah.
the event was that my mom died. I was really overcome with grief, but I was also really overcome with my own mortality.
Mm.
Like what am I doing here? Like kind of like the existential, like
Yeah.
what am I going to do that matters? And how am I going to live this life in a way um, that honors what I've witnessed in someone else's life
Mm.
ending? And during that time, a lot of writing, but I met with this. My husband knew of a coach that had done some executive coaching or something at the organization that he works for. And he just told me, I think you'll like this guy. I think you should meet him. So I blindly asked him to meet me for lunch. And I started telling it, he asked me some of the things that I might be interested in doing. And the first thing I told him, I laid out this whole vision of, I want to create a space, both literal and metaphorical, for women to come and create their what's next. And it's to be women building businesses and writing books and learning how to monetize their creative work. And they're going to support each other and they're going to encourage each other. And it's going to be beautiful. I had this whole vision. So I tell him that. And then I get said, or I gave him 10 other ideas that were like, I could do this, I could do that, I could do, my body language completely changed, my tone of voice completely changed. And he just sat back and said, isn't it obvious to you which one? But I had done exactly what you
Right.
described. I was like, well, I couldn't possibly do that. So let me tell you these other more
Right.
practical ideas that I have. And he just sat back and watched me and said, if you could just see and hear the way you describe what you actually want to do. He's like, it's obvious to everyone in this restaurant except for you. So it was interesting and humbling and a learning experience for
Such a
sure.
good story. Yeah. And to say to humans, and especially I think to say to women, like, trust your joy, trust that energy. That's counter to the messages most of us got.
Right.
I think we can have a lot of compassion for ourselves of why we wouldn't go, oh, good. I found something I feel, so excited about. I'm going to go do it. I know a million times I feel like I got the head pat of like, oh, like we don't just go do what's fun. Like that's not how the world works. And I think I was lucky even in getting that conditioning pretty lightly compared to so many
Yeah.
um others who it was such a fierce dominant narrative of their whole childhood. So yeah, we have to relearn that. And then also, you know, and this I think is this has been like an interesting evolution over the past 10 years. I think also separating out, like, we need to find the things that bring us joy. We need to find ways to do them. And those may or may not be what sustains us financially, and not tying up our sense of their worth, their validity, our success in doing them in this like very capitalistic frame of, if I'm good enough of it or if it's legitimate, I can make it into a livelihood. I think that's just not always true.
Right.
And doesn't really serve us to make that the holy grail.
Well, and what you're saying is a reminder of, like, we are whole people. So we don't have to have all of our passions, all of our values, all of our intentions. They don't all have to be in our work. They can also just be in our life, in our being.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd love for you to share. I know our listeners and viewers, I'm sure, are so curious about your own creative processes and how you get into creative flow. And you have an interesting, and you alluded to it, but you have an interesting body of work that you are diving into now around love.
Yeah.
Will you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. Um, yeah. Well, which part of that? How I get in my creative flow or the love stuff?
Well, I think a little bit of both. Let's talk about creative flow, because I'd love to know how you get a creative flow for something new. So, because you're exploring something that's, you know, that's it's an extension of the work and an
Yeah.
embodiment of the work that you've already done in playing big. But I'm curious what, even if there's tangible rituals that help you get in creative flow for exploring something new,
Yeah.
like the
Got
topic
it.
of love that you're exploring. And then I'd love to just hear more about the work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say for me, I think writing is the most rich creative place. Like I love dance, I love teaching, but if you want to know like, you know, where I feel like my heart is really soaring out of my chest, it's in the writing process. And so like with this book project, which I mean, this is maybe one aspect of my creative process. For about 4 years, I would not call it a book project, and I wouldn't even allow anyone on my team to call it a book project. And we have all these emails and files that are called the long prose project because I was like not ready to say that. And I didn't want to scare myself and I didn't want to formalize it. So that's part of it. That's also part of that's an example to me of like, how do you kind of game yourself and protect your own vulnerable inner artist and yet still get things done in the world?
Yes.
Mm. But so with this, it really was, it just started with kind of writing down one story or essay at a time, a lot drawn from parenting, because in the 10 years since I wrote Playing Big, I've had 3 kids. I've moved more into having like aging parents
Mhm.
that have health challenges that come up. I've had, the sort of, I feel like midlife intensity of just people start having a whole new level of difficulty and loss in their life. So what friendship looks like and all of that, So it just was years of a lot around all of that.
Mhm.
Um, and so just writing down, just giving myself permission to write one story and my reflections on it at a time, having really no idea where that was going. I don't know at what point I started thinking about it as a book. Um, And interestingly, actually, I mean, this is maybe an interesting story of creative evolution. The very beginning, I think the very first thing I started with was I actually thought for about a year that I was writing a book about women's experiences in higher education. And I like had research assistants who were experts on that. And I was reading all the academic literature. And I believe me, I have a lot of critiques of what women are experiencing in higher education. And my book was sort of like, if sometimes when I go back and read the material now, which it's still a topic I would love to write about, but it's a little bit like I was still a little too triggered to be right. It was sort of like Tara will yell at the colleges through this book was kind of what those drafts feel like, with some great footnotes backing her up.
That's amazing.
So I did that for about a year or two. And then there was like a slow there were like a f there was I think maybe it kind of happened, like, did it happen all in one day? There was like a day where after a couple years of work, I was like, "Oh, no." I was like, everything I want to say about higher education, like, I actually wanna say about the whole world.
Yes.
Like,
It's not about higher education.
it's
It's
not about
about
higher
something
education.
deeper.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is about, like, how we come back to the heart and how we honor the whole person and how we create gentler spaces and communities and interactions.
Yes.
And so that felt like for people who have had a baby, um, I will say, and for people who haven't had a baby, you could imagine this feeling or think of something in your body that felt like this. But when you're suddenly like, oh, no, 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 like that, I don't have enough room to push that out. Like, that's too big. Like, no. And not too big in a lack of confidence way, but it just felt like, oh, that's just really, there's a lot of,
It's just enormous.
yeah,
That's
it
all.
just
Yes.
like felt
Yes.
like I didn't know. I thought I had kind of done a lot of the pushing. And now it's like kind of like, now you're telling me I'm only at 3 centimeters?
Yes.
No. So that was that day, but it was like, no, that's true. That's what this project wants to be. And that's part of the listening to your project, and not being a dictator about it. Like you need to collaborate with what's trying to come through.
Yes.
So that was a pivot point. And then I think there were more a couple years of just writing essay by essay with that broader kind of scope. And then the past year and a half has sort of been more like, how do all those essays fit together? What could we say they're about? So it even took years to be like, oh, we could say they're all about love. Like it's but this book project, which it's almost the opposite of how Playing Big was as a process. This is a very bottoms up project. Like
Mm. Tell me more about
one
that. How,
like meaning like I'm writing one essay at a time and then having to understand how they're linked. And
yes.
and also it's a little bit less driven by a reader. Like Playing Big was really about those coaching clients. And this is a lot more like what I want to say. And so there's more work to figure out how does that intersect with what a reader might be needing or feeling in their life.
Yes.
So there, in a way, there's been more ambiguity. It's been a lot less of a linear process. And for the most part, and I do feel like this is a gift of maybe like being a little older or just having been writing consistently, for the past 15 years or so, like for the most part, I've been able, like I've had a pretty good amount of equanimity with that. I have my
Yeah.
days, but the emotional range is actually pretty contained because I feel like we'll get there when we get there, and I love and trust the material that's in there. Um, so that's how it's been, and now I'm leading a course. It's sort of a private course that we just did for our alums of other courses, but I have about 100 women who are in that course who are working through the material. So I really get to test things, and that feels really good.
Yes.
And then I'm interfacing with the publishing industry, which is both a blessing and there's so much wonderful collaboration. And there are times when it's hard because you're sort of productizing yourself and your creative work. Um, and that it's the same for anyone who's written a resume, or if you have a nonprofit organization that you love and you had to sort of package it up and sell it in a grant proposal. It's that kind of packaging, and in a way having to a little bit objectify oneself, that is it doesn't feel so good. But as far
Yeah.
as like tell, it's sort of a part, it sort of seems to be part of a necessary part of the process if you want to publish in a mainstream way. And I do love what that has done for helping the ideas I want to spread reach people. And I will also say, for those listening, just on that note, I think self-publishing and all of that is great. But I actually feel like I hear a lot of women kind of pre-giving up on themselves about trying to
Yes.
go for a major publisher. And it's because, there's great self-publishing options, and sometimes it's hard to see what mainstream publishing would do for you, but there's real infrastructure and distribution there that, just as someone who cares about women's voices changing culture, like I think if you feel like you and your work could be a decent shot with that, like it could be really worth exploring.
One, and what's interesting in what you just described is that in some of the iterations and maybe even internal and external pushback, something evolved in that process of iterating and fine tuning and experimenting and even changing course. Like, I mean, I think it's really inspiring for the listeners that you started a book on, on higher education and women that evolved and showed you the way to a book about love. So right there, I'm like, okay, that's extraordinarily inspiring. But
Mm.
then the iterative process that happened because you have taken the traditional publishing route before and are doing that again. I mean, there's a lot of learning and growth that came out of that and probably pushed you to explore your writing in a deeper way.
Yeah. And something that's really hard to discern. I don't know. I'd be curious how you discern this because I was just sitting with this last night. Like some feedback came back where I was testing some book titles with people and people loved this title that I don't love.
Mhm.
And so I had this thought like, well, is that just ego then? Like if is me holding on to is me not wanting that title in a way ego? Because if that title really works for the people I'm trying to reach and it telegraphs what the work is, you know, is that kind of a place where I want to, I don't know, I guess get out of my own way is one phrase that comes to mind, but just kind of surrender to that. And then I was like, well, no, because I'm the creator here and it has to feel
Yeah.
resonant for me. But this kind of fine line of, and I think when you interface with something like a publisher who really doesn't care what feels precious to you in any aspect of the work,
Right.
you're it forces this discernment of like, where do I need to really hold on to my voice? And where do I sort of need to let a larger collaborative process unfold? Um, and that's a really interesting question.
It is. And I don't have the answer. I think it's I think the reason that, or one reason that you're asking the thoughtful question might be because in our work we have seen so many women that we have guided and mentored, and probably seen it in ourselves, that when there's a response or a shaping of your work toward what you think people will accept or what you think people want from you, it's dangerous territory, right? Because we
Totally.
don't want to create for the sake of what we think people want or what they think we should create. And at the same time, I think what you're weighing is, but could this one place that I don't know if I want to use the word compromise, but compromise my vision,
Yeah.
if that makes it more accessible to more people that I can help, then I should consider that. So I see what you're weighing there. I don't have the answer, but it's an interesting, I mean, I think there's a lot of places as women that we can explore. Am I doing this because I think I should and because I think it's what people want from me?
Right.
Or am I doing this because I can have a broader brush of impact?
Exactly. That's a beautiful way of phrasing the question. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. It's so interesting. Tara, I could talk to you all day. I love our conversations. I can't wait to see where the book on love takes you. I can't wait to have it in my hands and reading it. For those of you that, whether you've read Playing Big before or not, I've read it many times. I've read excerpts of it in many of our workshops and classes. It's a really, really beautiful and substantially impactful book. So I encourage you to check it out. I'm curious, Tara, is there anything else that you'd love to share with our audience around creating next chapters or creativity, or is there anything else that springs forth for you?
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you to all those that listened. Yeah, Playing Big is there for you. For people who are thinking about coaching, not just as a dedicated path, but maybe also as something you integrate into how you parent or teach or act as a consultant. That's another area I've really fallen in love with that we didn't get to talk much about today. But for people who are interested in that, there's good stuff around that happening too, and all of that's over at my website. And yeah, for those on the plane who are feeling called to playing big, to check out some form of that work to support them.
Yes, and just shout out your website. We'll put everything in the show notes too, but
Yeah, it's just taramohr.com. Yeah.
yeah, perfect. Perfect. Well, Tara, thank you so much. Just a like literally like a dreamy conversation. And
Oh, thank you.
what I had wanted today, which is exactly what happened, is just for our listeners and viewers to get to experience our friendship too, and just the way that we flow back and forth on ideas and the way that we've lifted each other up
Mm,
during times where we didn't know what to do
yes.
next. So
Thank you. I love
I
that
I
too.
appreciate you so much, Tara. Thank you for
Right.
being here.
Wise.
I hope you found this episode helpful, idea provoking, and inspiring, especially if you're in the midst of creating or clarifying your next chapter. I can't even put into words how much I appreciate you, your vulnerability, your stories of creating a life and meaningful work amidst adversity, grief, ever-changing and challenging times, and of course, life's peaks and uncertain valleys. You are seekers, wisdom sharers, and artists of life, and together we can build meaningful next chapters that feel aligned with who we really are, what we're put on this earth to do, and how we can make a difference one human being at a time. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And I would love it if you could leave a review for The Art of What's Next. If you know someone who wants to create a new chapter or who would appreciate this episode, please share it with them. You can text it to them or email them the link or post about the show on your Instagram. If you want more help in creating your own meaningful next chapter, join the Hivery newsletter to get inspiration, stories, and resources to help you create your next chapter like an artist. Sign up at thehivery.com/podcast or at the link in the show notes.